Tēnā katoa, nau mai, haere mai. Welcome to this discussion of Maxim's policy paper, Eroding Our Conscience, Why We Must Shore Up Religious Freedom in Aotearoa, New Zealand. My name is Tim Wilson. I'm Executive Director at the Maxim Institute, and we're joined by Marcus Roberts, Senior Lecturer at University of Auckland Law School. It's great to have you here, Marcus. Good to see you.
Oh, thanks very much, Tim. Great to be here.
Thank you. And great also to those, great to have those who are joining us by live stream. Please send the questions. You will have questions. I hope you will. Send those into the chat. Put the word question in front of them. We are simple people after all, so that will alert us to that. And this discussion will run from now. It's 12:01, just about until 1 p.m. Look, we're talking about the importance of religious freedom. It's a case really of diagnosis, prognosis, remedy. What's the state of things? What's the evidence? Why is it important? I thought we might begin, Marcus, with some of the recent census data in terms of those people who I guess, assessing just what's the state of religiosity or religious belief in New Zealand. And the summary is that the no's have it. The proportion of people with no religion has increased from 48.2% in 2018 to 51.6% in 2023. The largest religious group is Christianity, but that number dropped from 36.5 in 2018 to 32.3 in 2023. Other large religious groupings are Hindu, increasing from 2.6% in 2018 to 2.9 in 2023, and Islam, which increased over that period from 1.3 to 1.5%. So mostly we're a nation of non-believers. Marcus, why should non-believers care about a discussion like this?
Yeah, Tim, it's a really good question. So the point to make about our current religious landscape is not only that we are becoming, as you say, a nation of non-believers, or at least those who say they've got no religiosity or no religion as the majority, but also those who have a religion. It's a far more fractured landscape. It's not just you've got people with no religion and then Christianity as the majority religion. It is still the largest religious grouping, as you say, but the landscape is much more fractured. It's, there's over 150 different religions that people are saying that they adhere to. So that's something I think at the outset we need to keep in mind. We talk about religion as a coverall for all these different beliefs, but no one actually believes in religion. They believe in a particular set of beliefs. And that's important to think about when we start thinking about diagnosis and how we can fix some of these problems identified in the policy paper, is that it's not just to have knowledge of religion per se, but there's a whole bunch of different beliefs out there and their numbers are increasing, particularly as immigration in New Zealand drives our population change. So that's caveat to throat clearing out of the way. Why?
I thought also just while you're raising it as well, what was interesting to me was the high levels, particularly in some areas of the country, of people pursuing, we could say, traditional Maori spiritual beliefs, and that's something I think that is probably increasing with the renewed interest into Maori. So that's another part of the kaleidoscope, I guess, that you're describing. You're saying it's not a big blob versus the non-believers. There's the actual groups of people. It's, as you say, quite fragmented.
Yes, that's right. And so that's just to keep in mind, as you say, it's not just two groups versus each other, or in tension with each other. So why should those who are in the majority now, who say that they are of no religion, why should they care about a human right to freely believe and freely worship whatever they wish to? And in a sense, that's an obvious question, because they would say, well, we don't need that right because we don't believe in a religion, and we don't need to worship or carry out or manifest our beliefs. There are a number of reasons, I think, put forward in the paper why it's important to support freedom of religion and to ensure that it's not eroded even if you don't believe. And the first reason, I think, is kind of the analogy to free speech. Why is free speech important? And it's not just about getting ideas out there, but receiving ideas. That if free speech is eroded, then you erode the ability to hear new ideas or new arguments. Just the same with religious freedom. The harder it is for religious groups to be open in their beliefs, to be open in the manifestations of their beliefs, the more closed, therefore, the religious marketplace of ideas, if you want to call it that way, is in this country. And therefore, the harder it is for people of all religions, but including those of no religion, to experience this marketplace of ideas, to engage with what fundamentally are the biggest questions that we will engage with in our lives. Why are we here? What's the meaning of life? Where will we go after this? These are the sorts of questions that when we engage with them as individuals, we are much better able to arrive at a better argued position if we are exposed to all the different answers that are out there. So
you could, I guess, in a sense, you're making an argument that those who have no religion, what would they have to push against if we suppress those who do have religion, or ignore? Let's say legally ignore, because this is a paper about the legal parameters around belief.
Yes, that's right. So the other point is that, yes, you say you're of no religion, but that's not a static thing throughout your life. I think we can, we all know people, or we may personally be people who used to say we're of no religion and then have changed our minds. Well, how did we change our minds? We changed our minds because we encountered people who believed, who manifested their belief, who were open to arguing with us, and therefore challenging our beliefs, challenging those core assumptions that we have about the most fundamental things in our existence, which lead us to change our mind. And that's, and of course that can work both ways. But the point is, this is not a static thing. There's a constant dialogue. And to the extent that that dialogue is stifled, we are stifling our own individual capability to ask and have these questions answered. So that's, I think, the primary reason why those with no religion should care about religious belief. But it's not the only freedom of religion. But it's not the only answer.
It's not the only answer. It's also quite. It's a difficult area, I think, to move in the sense that if you're applying the free speech argument, then you have to apply free speech arguments in some sense, say, to pornographers. Perhaps I'm just going to throw that in there. And you actually highlight something in your paper, which I think was really interesting, was the dividing line between incommensurate rights, i.e. those people who support the kosher killing of animals through their faith, and those animal rights activists who say, oh no, this is a dreadful thing that we must not do. There's a real, we can say, oh, one nourishes the other, but there are also times where there's a real friction there, and it's people who are diametrically opposed.
That's 100% right. There is a real tension there. And the law as it stands allows that tension insofar as we have a Bill of Rights in New Zealand, but it's not like we might imagine a Bill of Rights in America, for example. So it's not that there are these rights that cannot be derogated from, and they're the standard, and any law passed by the government that interferes with those rights will be struck down as unconstitutional, for example. In New Zealand, it doesn't work like that. We have these rights, two of which relate to freedom of religion, freedom of thought, conscience, and belief, which is kind of like what's going on internally, and then freedom to worship and manifest your religion externally. Both are protected in our Bill of Rights. But our Bill of Rights doesn't set them up as rights that are absolute. It says that the government can... so when you have a law that's inconsistent, you try and read the two laws together as far as possible. But to the extent that they're inconsistent, if it can be that the rights will fall away or will lose out to this other law, if you can demonstrate that that limit on the rights is justified in a free and democratic society. And so the law asks the courts to engage in that tension and in that battle, and in that question of, as you say, incommensurate rights. How are we meant to determine which should prevail. Because, as you say, those concerned about animal welfare would say, of course, this good is the highest good, at least in this debate. And those supporting the kosher killing of animals for religious reasons would argue, no, that isn't the higher good, that there is a higher religious good beyond animal welfare.
For those who haven't read the paper, how was that issue resolved, or was it resolved?
No, so it wasn't a legal argument. It was coming up in relation to proposed legislation or regulation. I can't quite remember if it was primary or secondary legislation around the regulating of killing and how. Yeah, so that's where it comes from. The point that then flows from that is the judges are put in this have this difficult task, but that's part of the job of figuring out which should give way of these two incommensurate rights. They are less likely to do a good job if they do not fully understand or are cognizant of the religious beliefs that have been put in front of them. And that's one of the concerns I think I have with religious freedom in this country, is that as we become less religious overall, I think those in positions of legal power also have less knowledge, personal, or they're not religious themselves. They don't have religious friends. And even if they do, they might not be the religion that's
that's under scrutiny here, or is complaining.
Yes, exactly. And so that's one of the concerns I have is how do we properly assess these two incommensurate rights if we're not fully grappling with what the religious practice is and why it's important.
And we'll get to your suggestions about that, which it's fascinating, because there's another case as well with Justice Ellis and a group of doctors who brought a case in 2021, and there was a and you've headlined this, minorities within minorities, about the Catholic Church's position on the abortion issue. But
yes.
If we can just pull back a bit, what's unique about our country in terms of this? I'm thinking about in terms of history, the legal. You've talked a bit about the legal frameworks of the Bill of Rights, and that sort of seems to be quite contestable in some way. What else did you discover as you were looking into this about us here in our land?
Yeah, well, if we go back to the very founding of our country, if we go back to the morning of the Treaty of Waitangi signing up in February 1840, there was a concern raised. It was actually by the Catholic Archbishop at the time, Bishop Pompallier, about the ability for everyone in New Zealand to be able to worship not just in the Church of England, but also traditional Maori spirituality and practices, the Wesleyan Church and the Church of Rome, as it was put at the time. There was a concern that people who weren't Church of England would be in some way discriminated against, although they probably wouldn't have used that word at the time. And there was an oral undertaking or promise by Governor Hobson, which didn't make it into the writing of the Treaty of Waitangi. We're talking about the day of the signing. There's no time to put anything else in.
Too late. Yeah.
Too late. But he orally made a promise that we will not discriminate, in essence, against people for their religious faith. And some people in the area, historians or legal scholars, have talked about this as the unwritten fourth article of the treaty, which I think gives it too much importance because it wasn't written. It was oral. It was only at Waitangi.
And it seems like this is more a sort of like a subset of the discussions that were being had at Waitangi.
Yes, but also I think there was an understanding at the time that this was not going to be a sectarian nation. There wasn't going to be a state church, and there never was a state church in this country. There was a.
Oh, come on! Don't you know about rugby? Are you kidding me?
I don't think William Webb Ellis had picked up his ball in 1840 yet and run with it, but
That's true.
maybe if they'd known about rugby, then yes,
Yeah.
they would have.
There would have
they
been a state
different.
religion.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
different. Of course. How are the All Blacks going?
Keep moving.
And so there was always I think from the very start of New Zealand, a understanding that there would be this freedom for people to believe what they want without governments discriminating against them on that basis. And so I thought that was quite an interesting starting point. That is a unique part of New Zealand's history that is unique from other countries. We are also, I think, unique. Maybe not unique, but not common in the fact that we have this Bill of Rights. That's not it's not an absolute document. It's not a constitutional document that cannot be derogated from. It clearly can be. And that was actually one of the debates at the time when the Bill of Rights was being drafted in the late 1980s by the Longi Labour government. Originally, it was planned that this would be a Bill of Rights akin to the American model, that you wouldn't be able to pass legislation that limited these rights and freedoms. And everyone panned it. Everyone was so against it that they had to.
Why was that, Marcus?
I think that for the same reasons.
Just quickly, because we're going to kick.
No. I think probably for the same reasons that people are against it now. In that, who are these judges to decide that they're not elected? In fact, how do judges get appointed? It's not very clear. It's not very clear to me, and I teach law. It's who you know a little bit. So you have these unaccountable, unelected judicial officials who are able to strike down legislation passed by Parliament, which represents the will of the people, because at the least we vote for them every 3 years. And they're accountable to us every 3 years. So I think it was a democratic accountability argument that we will instead, and that's where they went to the second, which was to have a Bill of Rights Act, which would have great moral and probably political force to say, hey, you're breaching the Bill of Rights, but it's not illegal for you to do so. But there will be, if it's serious enough, people will you'll pay a political price.
Yeah, and I guess the assumption too would be, if it's serious enough, there will be a democratic response to any breaches that occur, and that will be processed through Parliament.
Yes.
Look, I do want to I'm not seeing any questions yet. By all means, if you're listening and you have a question, don't hesitate to jump in and throw us something. We're all part of the conversation, and we've got about another 45 minutes. So please, if something snags in your thoughts, don't hesitate to get it down, and we can address it. Look, moving to freedom of religion. So I guess what you summarize in summary, you said, even though the Bill of Rights is somewhat gauzy, there's still a strong necessity in a post-religious society for freedom of religion, because it is a freedom of conscience issue. In terms of the most recent tests of freedom of religion, what do you see as those having been? And
Yes.
Look, we see there have been incidents such as the COVID response, incidents such as attacks on synagogues post October 7th last year, certainly the mosque attack in Christchurch, very tragic. But look, I'll leave it to you. Where do you see some of those major tests being, and how has our response been? Have we passed or have we failed? My sense is, given you've got the words eroding our conscience as the title for your paper, that you're not happy with some of the outcomes.
100%. Yeah, no, I'm not. And I'd start off by saying the obvious counter to that is, well, don't talk about eroding religious freedom. Go go live in Nigeria or North Korea. And yeah, of course, we're nowhere near as bad as those countries. And I'm very thankful that we live in a country that does have freedom of religion, both in its law and generally practiced as well. But that doesn't mean that there aren't concerns around where we're heading and where the erosion might go. And just because we're not at the bottom of the pile doesn't mean we can't be better than that. So what have the recent tests been? Well, the paper I looked at, we start off with the most obvious and visceral attacks on freedom of religion, which was attacks on believers. And obviously the mosque shootings of 2019 are the most obvious, when you are killing people in their place of worship because they are there to worship and who they are as religious believers. You not only are you are attacking those in the mosque at that time, but you're also attacking all believers in Islam, because you are making it, the obvious sociological response is fear and inability to feel that they can freely go and worship in open without heightened security. And then there was heightened security not only around mosques but also around synagogues at the time in 2019, and then, as you say, subsequently to the 2023 Hamas attack. And this also makes it, on the one hand, it makes it safer for people to go there, or hopefully will make it safer, have high fences, have security guards, but then you also make it a less welcoming place for people to go to worship. They feel that
there's a chilling effect of all that.
A chilling
security.
effect. Yeah, exactly. Necessary, but obviously a reduction in freedom of religion, I would say, and that's what Jewish and Muslim voices have said after those attacks. And the physical attacks are still ongoing, or the harassment is still ongoing. I've personally witnessed some harassment of a Jewish family who live on my street, for example. And so that's obviously the number one.
And they were being harassed because of their religion.
Yes, yeah, they were obviously Jews, and they were told to leave this country and go away and go back to Israel.
Wow.
There's a lot of F words used as well. So
okay.
Anyway, so I've seen that personally, but that's an obvious attack on people of those faiths' ability to manifest their religion openly via head coverings or going to mosque or going to synagogue. So that's the obvious test, I suppose, and that's not a legal test. Most of the other ones I talk about is legal, but it's obviously a cultural concern that we would have a situation where people feel that they are able to, or feel emboldened enough to do that, either physically attack or verbally harass people. The other example I actually use is the attacks on headstones, like Jewish headstones in cemeteries, is a more common occurrence than I realized in New Zealand. And that cultural view of religious freedom and whether or not it's important, the right to allow others who I don't share the faith of to manifest their religion.
Yeah.
The way in which we see that is important also then, I argue, feeds into the legal response. And the legal response, I think, is where we see that cultural, to the extent that we don't value freedom of religion as a society, then that will not only feed into attacks, for example, but also feed into the legal response to religious freedom when it comes before the courts. And so those are some of the other tests that I've looked at in the paper. So, for example, you mentioned the abortion case, the doctors bringing the abortion case a couple of years ago, where they were arguing about the requirement to refer on for abortions.
And just to be clear, this was a group of doctors who are opposed to abortion,
correct,
saying, look, because of our position on this issue, we don't want to be compelled to refer patients to other doctors who will, quote unquote, prescribe it.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
Yes, so that was a concern about having to refer and therefore being complicit in the process.
Yes.
And people might have a different view on how far complicity goes, things like that. But these doctors felt that was a breach of their freedom of thought, conscience, and belief, and so was a breach of their Bill of Rights. And this was dismissed by the judge in question, partly because she questioned whether the doctor's religious views were the views held by the mainstream of their faith, in this case, the Catholic Church. I understand that not all the doctors were Catholic, but that was the example used by by the judge in the case, saying that I understand that a lot of Catholics don't think abortion is wrong, or don't think that this would be complicit in abortion being forced to refer. And that comment is not relevant, really, to whether or not this particular minority thought that their religious freedom and beliefs were being impacted.
So the judge was saying, well, look, this is your interpretation, but given my impression of the majoritarian view on this,
or not even the majority view, just that there are other views within your religious faith. So the quote was, I would imagine that many adherents of the Catholic faith would now honor a good part of the church's teachings on abortion only in the breach. And many more would, I'm sure, support a more nuanced and less absolute approach. Okay, but that's not relevant. That is only relevant if you think that the Bill of Rights only protects those views that are pretty much unanimous within a particular faith community. And if you've been part of a faith community, you would think there's probably very few things that you can get unanimity on. And so that suggests that there's a weakening of the protections provided by the Bill of Rights Act, if that judge's position in this case is correct. Because then you are not protecting minority views within a religious minority. So I talk about minorities within minorities. And indeed, you're saying that the more controversial a view is, the less protection we're going to provide it under the Bill of Rights Act. But these are the very views that are the most important to protect. If a view has consensus, or if a view is of the majority opinion, there's far less likelihood that we need protection.
That it requires protection. Yeah. Look, the questions are starting to flow, Marcus. So I want to jump in. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but the question goes this: Manuka Henare made a clear definition about Maori religion in Tapu Mana Maori Ho Wairua. It was published in 2001. Does this help us in terms of encouraging religious freedom?
Yeah, I mean, I think that insofar as we are, I think that it helps insofar as you are saying that there's many more religions that are protected by religious freedom than the old, Christianity that your grandparents went to, and that might have all sorts of baggage that people attach to it. That religious freedom of religion is a catch-all, as I said at the start, for a number of different religions, including, and as you mentioned in the census data, Tim, Maori spirituality and traditional Maori worship, both Christian and non-Christian, is growing. And so that's part of the religions that are protected by the Bill of Rights Act, or should be protected by the Bill of Rights Act. So any erosion of that protection also affects Maori spiritual practices or Maori religions as defined in the 2001 publication.
Okay, there's a follow-up question, which offered by the person who posed this one. But is it also complicated by Krogh 2015? And I'm not aware of this, so I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, saying that only Māori spiritual values are protected under the Treaty of Waitangi and its ramifications in other legislation.
So I'm just reading the question at the same time. So yeah, you're right. I mean, that I think is partly a debate around the importance or otherwise of that oral fourth argument that I was talking about. And in my understanding, I'm not an expert in the historiography or the current importance of that, except I understand that calling it the fourth article, for example, most people would say, well, that's giving it too much importance. The Bill of Rights Act does not, and the protections provided to freedom of religion under that act do not interact expressly with the Treaty of Waitangi. There may be additional protections that are arguable under the Treaty of Waitangi, but the Bill of Rights Act provides protection to all religions, So you need to show that you have religious faith. The law tends to suggest that the courts are very expansive in the definition of religion, and that they don't want to bar people from gaining protection under the Bill of Rights Act
Yeah,
by saying whether or not it's a religion or not. They generally don't want to get involved.
because I was going to ask, is a spirituality different to a religion? And if not, why not? And if so, how so?
So not in terms of protection of thought, conscience, and belief.
Right.
That the protection under Section 13 of the Bill of Rights Act talks about protection for thought, conscience, belief, religion. So that's a broad coverall that would protect. So, for example, going back to the abortion example, it would protect people of no faith who have a conscientious objection to abortion. And the referrals of abortion. So it doesn't have to be a religious motivation for that. Manifestation of belief under Section 15. No, I think, again, the courts, I just do not think that the courts are going to get into a argument about whether or not this is a religion if they can help it.
Yeah.
That they'll allow it through the gate.
Having said that, though, if you're talking about that previous issue with, I think it was Justice Ellis, saying, well, actually, this part of the faith counts, or this part of following the faith counts,
Yes.
but this one doesn't. You would say that that's something generally the courts have tried to avoid doing.
That's my understanding. Yes, that's right. The gatekeeping part of, is this even protected by Section 13 or 15? They generally say, oh, we're not going to deal with it there. We'll deal with it subsequently when we figure out if the limit proposed by the legislation on that right is one that is justifiable in a free and democratic society. That's where they'll bring in and the question is that limit more justifiable if fewer people are adhering to that belief or faith, which is the suggestion in the Abortion Healthcare Alliance case. The only way I think you can rescue that or read that comment by the judge in that case consistent with how the Bill of Rights should play out is to say, because so few people in your faith tradition believe this, you don't actually believe this. Like, it's a matter of evidence as to whether or not you actually hold that belief that you're arguing. But that's not how it was used then.
That seems like a difficult position to maintain, because
why would you bring a case?
Yeah. If you don't believe this,
okay. Why would you be there? Exactly. So I just don't see the relevance for discussing this in the case, and that's why it's concerning.
And I think too, and we're going to get to what you see as somewhat problematic amongst those who are arbitrating in these areas. This is not just the judiciary, but public service. What we might do to ensure that people have a full understanding of what religious belief and observation and passion looks like. We'll get to that. I'm interested in also, and please keep the questions coming, by the way. I hope that was helpful with those first two questions about Māori spiritual values. We've got a question coming from Josiah shortly, but I just we've talked about a kind of antagonism, I guess, between, I'd say more oppositional.
Tension's a good word.
Tension. All right. Yeah. I'll use tension. I don't love that word because I think it's a weasel word for conflict. But what about indifference? So my understanding was that not my understanding. We've done a paper on COVID and the Constitution, and done by Alex Penk here at Maxim Institute, and there was amongst those in the public service who were briefing ministers just an unawareness of the importance of freedom of religion during the COVID response time.
Yeah.
So yeah, can you unpack that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, it was quite a shocking example. What happens is that whenever a bill is being presented, so a proposed legislation comes to the Parliament, the Attorney General has a responsibility under the Bill of Rights Act to report about the proposed bill and whether it limits or appears to limit rights under the Bill of Rights Act. And in order to prepare these reports, the Minister, the Attorney General, is helped by briefings provided by public servants in the Ministry of Justice. And they provide these essentially legal opinions saying, we think or we do not think that this impacts upon the rights under the Bill of Rights Act. And if it does, it's justifiable for these reasons. And during COVID, there were two instances of legislation being passed. One, giving the government the power to lock people in their homes, the lockdown orders. And secondly, giving the rule makers the power to make compulsory vaccinations for certain areas of work. So compulsory vaccinations. Both of those pieces of legislation had reports that were prepared by the policymakers in the Ministry of Justice, both of which ignored, as in didn't comment at all, about the potential effect that this would have on freedom of religion.
I just want to unpack ignore. Didn't comment at all. Do you have any inkling as to whether that was a deliberate act? Was it a commission or an omission? Or I guess
it was definitely an omission. It's whether it was a deliberate omission or not.
Yeah.
So what I will say is that there are 20 enumerated rights under the Bill of Rights Act. The Bill of Rights Act is very short. It seems incredible that when you are thinking about locking people in their homes, that you would not consider the effect that this would have on people's rights. That shows a profound ignorance as to what being a religious believer for most faith traditions means, or something worse. I don't know. I'm not prepared to.
Sure. Is there any evidence that other aspects of the Bill of Rights were considered for that legislation?
Oh, so the report went through a number of different rights, such as freedom of association, freedom of movement, and how these were obviously impacted by this stay-at-home order, for example. But freedom of worship, freedom of manifestation of religious belief was not considered. And anyone with a passing knowledge of, I would have thought, even Christianity, which is still, a third of the population, according to the census, would say, well, coming together and worshiping in community is an important part. And surely it's not even to say that it's justified. It's saying that it's not even engaged at all, that it's not even a prima facie breach of or limitation on the Bill of Rights, or freedom of religion under the Bill of Rights. Just seems incredible. And again, then this was repeated when the legislation was put forward to make vaccines mandatory. This one, perhaps, you could argue is a bit more forgivable. But again, the idea that people who are the policymakers whose job it is to prepare these reports so that the minister can fulfill his or her duty under the Bill of Rights Act to prepare these reports wouldn't go and consider how forced vaccinations may be viewed from a religious point of view, or from some religious point of view, suggests again a lack of knowledge about these religious beliefs that is impacting their ability to do their jobs.
Did any cases ensue from these particular instances?
So the case that ensued around lockdowns was slightly different. There was a case called Aotearoa Community Church, which was a group of a number of different churches and mosques that came together and said that the COVID response and keeping churches closed when other aspects of the community were open, such as petrol stations. I think they got to a stage where bars, for example, were open with limitations on numbers. That was a breach of their freedom to manifest religious belief that was unjustifiable in a free and democratic society because it was inconsistent. And the High Court, so that wasn't so much around the Attorney General's report. The Attorney General's report, you can't really go after. You could judicially review it, I suppose, but you would then have to say, well, what would have been the result if they had included in the report? Probably nothing different. They still would have passed.
Yeah, the outcome would have been the same. Yeah.
but maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe if they thought about it, they would have said, "Oh, maybe." Who knows? But going back to the Orewa Community Church case, the court effectively said, "Look, the inconsistency between keeping churches closed and keeping these other businesses and areas of life open was not an inconsistency, because the government had said that these other areas that were open were essential, and churches were inessential." But
so the court said, well, judging by the rules that the government made,
yes,
extraneous to aspects of the Bill of Rights, we find no case to.
there was a justifiable limit, because
Yeah.
these areas were essential as the government declared, and these other ones weren't. So you can't say it's unjustifiable because it was inconsistent, which dodges the question, because of course those who are arguing it would say, well, we just we don't agree with that categorization. And again, I think that shows a lack of grappling with the seriousness or what people actually believe, and why religious believers might think going to the mosque on Friday together and worshipping is important part of Islamic law.
And you could you could also say that many Catholics would argue that keeping bars open is just as important as keeping churches open, but that's another.
But no more important, perhaps.
But no more important. We've got a question from Richard and Josiah. We will get to your question as well. Richard asks, how is the right to the, quote, manifestation of religious belief distinct from the rights of freedom of expression and association? I think it's also, as I understand it, Richard's saying why.
Why are they different?
Well, how and why, I think. Yeah.
So that's a good question. They are linked insofar as when you prevent people from exercising their freedom to worship together, you are necessarily also limiting their freedom to associate together. It's a subset of association that you are then preventing. When you are preventing people from preaching, for example, you are then limiting a subset of freedom of expression. So yes, there is an overlap there, but I think it's also a recognition that some religious practices may not fit neatly into expression and or association. So maybe the kosher meats example, it's kind of awkward to say that this is a freedom of expression. It's not really. It's a freedom of manifestation of my religious belief. So I think there's
another area there that needs.
I think so. There's a Venn diagram. If you're spatial, there's an overlap, but there's also parts that don't easily fit within the two. And so you just make it easier to say, well, it's not I don't have to argue that it's freedom of expression or freedom of association. I can just come under freedom of manifestation of religious belief. And it's also, I think, a recognition that it's important, that it's something different from freedom of association and freedom of expression. It's attending to different parts of the human condition. But it's also one of the arguments, I think, why societies suffer when freedom of religious expression or freedom of manifestation is eroded, and that it then becomes hard to say, or hard to protect those other rights that perhaps non-believers might value more, such as freedom of expression, freedom of association, because then you've got the government saying, well, this part of expression is not allowed. Yeah, and we got to make that decision. This association is not allowed or not protected, and we're going to make that distinction. And it's very hard to see how you would make that distinction a bright line that doesn't overextend into other areas of association and movement.
Do you have, because you mentioned Nigeria and North Korea earlier in our conversation, are there any stats on countries who have greater religious freedom in terms of other freedoms available, or are there any international surveys?
Yeah, so one survey that looked at for the first, I think it's about 12 or 15 years of this century, so the 21st century, and they looked at the correlation between freedom of religion and religious violence. And in this case, it's a negative correlation. So the more free a society is for its religious minorities, the less likely there is to be persecution by other members of society, but also discrimination by the government. So these are the sociologists Brian Grimm and Roger Finke, and they concluded that 44% of all governments that interfered with an individual's right to worship suffered more than 200 cases of violent religious persecution a year, compared to only 9% of governments which did not interfere. So it's not saying you're 100% protected, but you're 5 times more likely to have large numbers of violent religious persecution when you are not protective of the right to freedom of religion
and
at a legal level.
This is a violent religious persecution by the state of particular religious groups, or is this by individuals? I don't know if you can unpack that or not.
Both violent persecution, and often it's very hard to determine which is which. That you get governments that whip up persecutory
proxies who then
persecutory feelings in people, but it's not the state doing it. It's just this random mob that
that's
propagandized.
That was the role played by radio stations in the Rwandan genocide. Actually, that.
I think there are other examples. People argue around like India, some of the violence that happens there, for example, or perhaps Sri Lanka, or other examples around that. So there is this correlation between the societal violence, I suppose, against religions and the legal protection afforded to religious freedom. And I don't think you can say that one necessarily causes the other. I think that whole canard around, politics is downstream from culture or vice versa, and you argue about that. I think they're clearly intertwined. That how much and the way
Go
that
on, pick a winner, Marcus. Politics or culture? Come on.
Well, it's the chicken or egg, really.
Okay.
I think I think it's one of those circle diagrams where the arrows point around and they influence each other. I think that's what actually happens.
Yeah.
And as we see, there's a fantastic quotation that I come back to a couple of times by our ex-Chief Justice, Sean Elias, who says, look, human rights, not just religious freedom, but all human rights, the extent to which they are valued in our society is the extent that they will be protected by our courts and our institutions. That the extent to which we don't think they're valuable as a society, the courts, the institutions very quickly pick up on that because they are part of that society.
Yeah.
But also think about the legal test in the Bill of Rights Act, justifiable in a free and democratic society. What is justifiable will change depending on what we think is a justifiable limit. So to the extent that we don't think freedom of religion is important, as a society, which is then reflected by the courts will allow or will tolerate greater limitations on that right.
Which is why, in some sense, I began with that census data about the fact that we're mostly non-believing in this country now. Look, I'll go back to, I've got a question from someone called Left, but it seems to have stopped halfway through. So Left, if you want to put your question or complete your question, let's ask, Josiah has a question here. What do you, do you think protecting religious freedom in New Zealand requires better laws or other safeguards? What are the limits of the law? And if the law fails to protect citizens, what then? And I guess we're getting now, given that we've got about 12 more minutes left, we're getting to we've described diagnosis, a bit of prognosis. We're getting more to remedy.
Yeah, so I do not think that law is the ultimate safeguard. There's the great example that one of the best...
Wait, you're a law lecturer.
Oh, yeah, I know. It's,
No, I guess what you're saying is you can see the limitations of the law, that it's not that the law does certain things. I
was just going to say that, one of the best human rights documents you can read is the Constitution of the USSR. Looks fantastic on paper, but as anyone
with more than a passing
knowledge of what happened in the USSR, it was hardly a human rights utopia. So our laws are important. And having religious freedom in our legal, having it legally protected is important. But again, I come back to, if the culture and society at large doesn't value it, then I do not think that our legal protections will stand forever, for long. So what can we do about it? What can we get better laws? Perhaps I think our laws are fine as they are. We just need to, I think, ensure that those who are tasked with policing the laws, the policymakers we've talked about, the Ministry of Justice, the judges, I think need to have a greater understanding of where perhaps their limitations in their knowledge lies. And this is not to have a go at them. This is an understanding that New Zealand is a very fractured religious landscape. And if you're going to then adjudicate cases between religions that you have no passing knowledge of, and perhaps because of your background and circumstances, that's all religions, then you need to make sure that you are up to speed have at least a base knowledge of the tenets of the major faiths in New Zealand, to treat it as professional development.
So how would you go about it? Does that mean that once a week, 1 week you'll be like the Prime Minister? Once a week you'll be in a mosque, then you might be in a temple, then you might go along to the Anglican Church. How would that actually occur? Is there a structure for that? And I know that you mentioned a particular organisation, American organisation.
There are organisations out there that provide to other organisations, corporates mainly, but other NGOs, for example, provide training on aspects of religious liberty and also tenets of various faiths. And look, it's not going to be you have to be an expert scholar in each of these faiths, but just to realize, well, maybe Muslims and Christians think that freedom of being able to worship is an essential part of their lives, and why that is. That to have that baseline knowledge, and this also doesn't take away the fact that it's up to the lawyers who are representing their clients to make the strong arguments for why it's important or essential for our clients to go to church. But if the courts, the judges who are sitting on these cases have more of a baseline knowledge, then it means that they're a better starting point to have that knowledge supplemented by the arguments of the judges. So these are organizations out there that can provide, in the same way that judges should be up to speed in the latest developments in international law, company law, etc., part of their ability to judge human rights cases, in particular religious freedom cases, shouldn't.
Marcus appears to have frozen. We'll just see if we can get him back. So it's, just if I can continue. Oh, there we go. It's gone. The screens. He must have been saying something controversial. I wasn't aware that he was. But Marcus was saying, and this is one of the recommendations of the paper, is that there are courses that members of the judiciary can take, public servants can take, to familiarise themselves with the fundamentals of religious belief. And Marcus is back. I just don't know what happened then. You must.
Good summation, Tim.
Yep. So look, we were talking a bit about some of those, I guess, and you call it PD for members of the judiciary, for public servants, etc. To understand,
public servants making the same argument.
Yeah. We've got another question here that, and this is just I asked someone to expound on their question. I don't think their name is actually left, but we'll take it. Question: the Liberal state uses the phrase right to religious freedom, but at the same time, being liberal, it doesn't recognize prior traditions as binding on individuals. Left Foot Media, there we go. Left Foot Media. What are the implications?
So,
and you've got 6 minutes.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think about it. So the implications, I think, are that as was described, the Liberal state or the current New Zealand state and legal institutions do not have that your religious freedom is absolute. As I've said, there's a tension there between other goods that judges and policymakers and politicians have to juggle. And so there's no recognition, I suppose, as you say, of previous traditions above the state or apart from the state. Whereas as individuals and as individual believers, New Zealanders might have a very different view of the, I suppose, hierarchy of obligations. And it's actually one of the arguments I put forward as to why it's good for society and good for all of us, whether we're believers or not, to have a strong religious freedom legally and culturally, is that it provides another locus or focal point of obligation, or that we have as individuals, we don't just have the individual and the state. There's a mediating institution here, in this case the church, but also all the other religious charities and organizations that religious people and religions populate and put forward.
I guess it expands the vocabulary that we're using to understand freedom of expression, doesn't it? That's the
yes, but we also have obligations aside from our obligations to the state.
Yes,
and that is a check against overbearing and indeed authoritarian government. There's a reason why revolutions that put forward in authoritarian governments will go after the churches first, go after the religions first, because they're another locus of authority as opposed to the state, so that people won't prepare to follow the state in all things because, I'm the king's servant, but God's first. That you have a higher authority, and that insofar as you have these other locuses of authority, that's very challenging to the state, and that might be challenging to people who have a somewhat totalitarian nature of the state. But for those of us who think that the state should be bounded, and that there are some aspects of our lives and societies that should not be regulated or constrained or totally constrained by the state, then that's a very good thing, I think.
I guess it also stems from the notion of where do we, and I think in New Zealand we have a view that the state is fundamentally benign.
Yes.
And there will be groups within the country who disagree with that strongly. But it's like, where does goodness come from? I think many New Zealanders think, well, the state, often when there's a problem that's spoken about in the public square, it's like, well, what can the government do about this? As if the government can solve so many of our
should solve everything
and should solve all of our problems. Look, Marcus, people are jumping out. Richard says, just a note of appreciation for a good conversation, and Sandy too says, and from me too, thanks heaps. I've got to run. I want to hear from you. Are you optimistic, pessimistic about the future of religious expression in New Zealand, and if so, why? And if not, what should we do about it individually? And you've got 2 minutes.
No. So I think I'll start with the end. What can we do individually? I think for believers, we should be more bullish and out there with our religious faith in the public square. That if we retreat from the public square or only provide arguments in the public square that are necessarily secular, then we, I think, cede a lot of ground to a non-religious view of society. But if we are willing to say, hey, I have a view on this particular social or political problem, this view stems from my religious belief, quite frankly, just like all political or social views stem from some prior belief. Then
I guess too non-believers have to, or believers have to persuade non-believers that this is an important freedom to maintain too.
Yes, that's right. But being open around your own faith, but also, as you say, yes, the importance. If we're not prepared to say why freedom of religion is important, then why should anyone else? So I think that's what we can do. But also, I think for those who are convinced by the arguments for why freedom of religion is important, who aren't believers, to also do the same. And to speak out when people are or governments are trying to limit the freedom of religion via putting in submissions, even speaking to select committees, talking to your MPs, talking to your local MP, that is, supporting those who perhaps are taking cases, if that's relevant, financially or just morally. Am I pessimistic or optimistic? I am pessimistic if things continue as they are, but there is always room for sudden reversals or perhaps revivals, if you want to use that term. There's a great line from a movie that seems to solve many of these sort of questions, the Blues Brothers, the original, not Blues Brothers 2000, where Cab Calloway says to Jake and Elwood Blues, "You boys got to go to church." And I would say that, if we're believers and we believe something and we want to have that belief strengthened in society and protected in society, then we need to, I suppose, put our money where our mouth is. Go to church or mosque or synagogue or temple.
Or bar. No,
or
kidding.
Or the rugby pitch.
Or the right, exactly. Look, quoting from the movie The Blues Brothers to end an
good
august
conversation when that happens.
On the importance of maintaining freedom of religion. Thank you very much, Marcus.
Thank you, Tim.
It's been a pleasure, and thanks to all those who listen. And Brendan says thanks for the great conversation, guys. So thank you for joining us. Ka kite.
Thank you.